Skinner's Wiggle. So, last looking for you. I'm not exactly sure what number this is, but in the process of delivering these videos, there is a progression. So, in the last one that I recorded, what I covered was the disruption of our peace. So what I want to start out with this video is some of the results of that, both in terms of real, but also in terms of stereotypes. Because essentially what we're talking about here is a healing process. So from a civilization point of view, one of those processes that came about with the creation of the Great Law of Peace is a thing called the edge of the woods. So it's rather complicated. So I'll get into that. But right now, what I want to do is talk about some of the perspectives that have been put upon indigenous people, indigenous men, as a result of colonization, acculturation, oppression, all of those things. And then we'll get into why we need to do the work to heal, not just from the real things that happened, but from all of the connotations that come with these misrepresentations of who we are and where we come from, and why that's important to understand. So, a lot of those misrepresentations, stereotypes, false beliefs, falsehoods about indigenous people. One of the original things, one of the biggest things that is still said out there, is that we were discovered by Columbus. Why is that problematic? Essentially saying that we were discovered, it reduces us to a place below human. You discover things like gold. You discover land, things like that. But what you don't discover is people, because people exist. People are sentient. We think, we feel, we process, we contemplate, we understand things. So in that sense, you can look at it as saying that we were discovered. The implication is that we were lost or we were missing. We were none of those. We existed here for thousands of years prior to Columbus arriving. And he didn't even arrive in North America. He arrived in the Caribbean area. So this idea that this man, there were 3 ships, and essentially what it was he was lost, and he wasn't looking to find new land. He wasn't looking to find new people. He wasn't looking to do any of that. What he was looking for was a quicker route to India. And in that, what he was looking for it wasn't about meeting the culture of the people who occupied India. It was about finances. It was about riches. The things that they had, they wanted trade. And the thing is, in what was known, the known world, from their perspective, there was a huge landmass between India and Europe. And so in order to reach that, they had to travel overland through many different countries, through many different kingdoms, many different civilizations that weren't necessarily welcoming to Europeans. Um, Even trade routes that were um, using the ocean. They were going through other people's territories, or else they were going through some pretty inhospitable waterways. And so they were looking for easier access to India. And he, uh, he and a few others suspected that the world was round. That if they went straight, they'd come around to India. Um, but going into the unknown, and being lost, and then as it was, he was within a few days of whole-scale mutiny by his men when he landed on the shores of the Americas. Um, and in reality, um, there were quite a number of other civilizations that um, had already been to North America, even a European one, the Vikings. Uh, Predating the Vikings, people from East Asia. Not exactly sure which cultures, and history speaking, they're not exactly sure either. But on the coast of California, they discovered in the water on the floor um, these round balls, and what they trying to figure out, well, where did they come from? And what they've discovered is that um, there was a period of time where um, Chinese and Japanese and other um, um, Asian countries used these balls as anchors for their ships, and dating some of the rock. Um, their source has been discovered to be in Asia. Um, there's even evidence to suggest that people from Africa had also come in contact with the Americas. And there's also evidence that some of the Polynesian islands, not all, but some, were populated by North Americans. Not going to go into all that history, but just understanding that um, our history didn't start with Columbus. And in reality, Columbus was an accidental blip, really. Um, um, now, mind you, the significance is that with his documentation and then um, creating these routes directly from Europe to North America, how that changed our history. And they tried very hard to erase our history, our knowledge of who we are and where we come from. That is all part of that connotation of us being discovered by Columbus. He didn't really discover anything. Other fallacies, that we are naturally drunks. And I talked about in the previous video how we came in contact with things like alcohol. Now, in understanding of that, scientifically speaking, now mind you, I learned this when I was through high school, a little bit into university. Generally speaking, what now the numbers may have changed since then, because we're looking at over 20 years now. But they say it takes any species around 2,000 to 3,000 years to acclimate physically to changes in their diet. Anything that's introduced to them. So when Europeans came over, they'd already had thousands of years of alcohol use, alcohol abuse, the creation of alcohol, the multitude of alcohols. So in that framing, at the longest, you'd could say that indigenous people have about 500 years. But that number decreases the further west you go. For the Haudenosaunee, we're looking more at around about 300 years. If you go to the Plains people, for a lot of them, maybe around 200 years. And for some people on the West Coast, about 100. So we are very, very, we're not very far into that acclimating to the introduction of alcohol. And if you extrapolate that a little further, high rates of diabetes and different diseases, there's a strong correlation to the addition of refined sugars, things like milk, wheat. We are very much less tolerant of those things in our diet. So a lot of the physical ills that come along with those things, it's no wonder that happens to us. Realistically, our descendants are going to be not quite 2,000 years in the future before they're able to deal with this in the same way that other people are who have had much longer time ingesting those things. The characterization of us as lazy. We're not lazy. Generally speaking, from a civilization point of view, we do what's needed to be done when it's appropriate to do it. And I can give you a piece of that. In my upbringing with my parents, what they told me growing up, going into school, basically what they told me and my brothers, it was how they approached school when they were kids. You go to school to learn what you need to learn to do what it is that you're going to do, and to get the whatever requirements are there to enter whatever that is. So I know my father. He was an iron worker, and at the time you needed grade 10 to get into the ironworking trade. So he quit school in grade 10 after he graduated from grade 10. My goal in high school was to graduate grade 12, because when I was in high school, you needed grade 12 to become an iron worker. Now, mind you, my dad didn't let us be iron workers. He put the word out to guys not to hire his sons and things like that. So, but that was me and my brother's goal, was to get our grade 12s and go into ironworking, because that was the requirement to become an iron worker at the time. And now what I was told too was, now this is years after the fact, that there would be a teacher who, usually about in grade 9 or 10, who would tell the students that roughly 90 to 95% of the schoolwork that you were going to do in high school, you are never going to see outside of high school. And it's going to be largely irrelevant in terms of further education, work, anything like that. So you tell a bunch of people who have been brought up with that mindset that you learn what you need to learn to do what you're going to do, and then you're told what you're learning isn't going to be relevant to what you got to do. So that was a very common thing amongst a lot of my peers, was to pass a high school course, you needed 50% plus 1. So that was our goal, and a lot of us, that's what we did. Most of my friends, now I went to a school that didn't have, at the time they had basic, advanced, and I can't remember what the middle one was. General, basic, general, advanced. And most of my friends were in general courses. So I would sign up for general courses, but whenever I get my transcript back, or not my transcript, my course load back, I would always have been bumped up into the advanced. Not my choice, because I understood the advanced work was a little bit more was a little bit more difficult. Um, and because I didn't see it as being relevant to what I wanted to do, why would I waste the energy and the time to do more difficult work? Um, that was my perspective. So, in terms of work, um, essentially, what I saw a lot of my friends and people that my family and things like that was um, they had these goals. For me, it was getting my driver's license and getting a car. So I worked towards that. And as I got older, that always seemed to be how I did things. Um, I had a particular goal in mind, and I had a plan on how to do it, and that's what I did. Um, after I graduated university, after I got my bachelor's degree, a buddy of mine, he was pressuring me to go get a master's degree, and because all I really wanted was to finish this bachelor's degree, get that piece of paper. I didn't quite see the connection, what he was trying to do, because what he was saying was, well, our people need PhDs. I said, okay, what's that got to do with me? And so, well, you can't get your PhD unless you get your master's degree. Oh, so that's what you're talking about. Well, as far as I was concerned, I didn't want to get a PhD. Not because I didn't want a PhD, but for the same reason. It's a lot of work. And my experience with university was that the focus of your undergraduate, which is what you get which is what you go through to get your bachelor's degree, is you learn what the teacher wants you to learn because it's what the teacher likes, and your mark was heavily dependent on whether they liked what you said. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of professors who they like the discourse, they like the argument, they like seeing different perspectives. But there was also a lot who, for the most part, they wanted you to be their fans, regurgitate what they said in class. So I didn't want to put myself through another 2 years to get a master's degree and then 4 years or more for a PhD, because I didn't see the point in putting myself through that without really studying or learning what I want. I love to learn, but one of the things I don't care for is being graded on it. I learn what I want to know because it's what I want to know. And generally speaking, that's the focus that a lot of Indigenous people have, whether it's education, whether it's work, whether it's setting goals and achieving those goals. In that sense, they're goal oriented, and that's the focus. Achieving things for the sake of achieving things, yeah, that's there. But there tends to have to be this sense of there has to be a purpose. And sometimes that purpose is a larger purpose. A lot of times it's a larger purpose. So, and I've heard that many times with a lot of people is, I don't want to waste my time. So if you have people who look at achieving things largely for the sake of achieving it because they're told that's what they want, which tends to be what I see in the mainstream culture. That's not with purpose, at least not a relevant purpose to living in life. So when people from that side look at that, they can interpret that as being lazy. Nowadays, that phrase that's become now is living your best life, which means not necessarily achieving goals because you're told that's what your goal, but doing what you want. That's essentially how Indigenous people are taught. Yeah. So that goes into a much larger discussion around this perspective that we're lazy. Um, this concept that are telling us that we're bad parents. Um, Now this comes from a view from the civilization where the nuclear family is basically the standard that they go by. Um, a mother, father, and children. Not the parents don't necessarily have strong connections in terms of um, community and communalism to their siblings. Um, Once they leave the nest, the parents, although the connections to varying degrees, but essentially they're not big parts of life anymore. Um, you know, I know tons of people where their parents live in one city and they live on another city, hundreds, thousands of miles away. Um, a lot of them they don't see family um, that often um, because it's that nuclear family. It's that essentially egocentric um, um, way of living a life. You know, my interests are ultimately what's important. Very individualistic. Um, now that's not a black and white thing, and that's not necessarily a white paintbrush that is there, but um, that's a big part of how they view the nuclear family. Um, Indigenous people, uh, we generally have a view of family as being um, extended. So extended family, uh, now that's a mainstream term to incorporate. There's the nuclear family, then the extensions, siblings and their families, parents, grandparents, and their families, aunts and uncles and things like that. In most indigenous civilizations, um, it doesn't exist that way. Like when someone has asked me how many people could you figure are you would consider close relatives, um, and I can't give them a number because when I think of close relatives, um, I think of um, my direct close relatives here, both my father's side and my mother's side, are extended relatives there. Though I consider those close families, and relatives that are in other communities around, through the states and Tanganyika and things like that. Um, I also consider them close family. But a lot of times when people are asking that from the mainstream, they mean your nuclear family and short extensions from that. That's generally not how we do that. And if you look at the Six Nations community in particular, uh, when we look at where families live, um, generally speaking, you see a household, but all the households within, like neighbors and across the road, are family. You know, I know my family. Here we have, because we are the largest reserve in Canada. Um, Different sections of the reserve are named for families that live there. I come from Logan Valley um, because there's a bit of a valley, and then there's another little valley that goes onto the river. And in that area, it's my aunts, my uncles, cousins, um, and in my growing up, uh, there wasn't a sense of this is my yard. It was all my yard. I could go anywhere. Um, and my parents weren't necessarily worried if they couldn't see me because um, as I was younger, um, generally what would be considered my walking distance was all in family territory. And as I got older, being able to go a little further, there was a confidence that I wasn't going to be alone. I had other family that with me. Um, and in the mainstream, sometimes that's looked at as um, um, negligent parenting. Nowadays, they talk about that you see a child out by themselves. Well, where's the parents? Why are the parents watching them? But in most Indigenous communities, whether it's in a modern community or in our community before contact, um, everybody close by was family, so you were generally safe. um, particularly in Haudenosaunee families. Um, Cousins were brought up as brothers and sisters because they literally lived in the same house. Um, so me listening to my parents wasn't a whole lot different from listening to an aunt or an uncle, or even a close friend of my parents. Um, Now, mind you, that's have to take into consideration in this explanation some of those um, effects um, of the disruption of our peace. Um, so, through things like residential school and um, the foster care system and being adopted out and things like that, and some of the abuses that our people have gone through, a lot of our people have become abusive, whether that's physically abusive, being sexual predators and things like that. So that safety isn't borne out the same way. So have to take that into consideration. But generally speaking, that's the view from the mainstream that we are bad parents, is that we don't care for our children. The reality is we don't care for our children the way they care for their children. We care for them as more of a reflection of our civilization. Other things, we get things for free. We're all on welfare. We don't pay taxes. That's all about treaty rights. That's about those agreements. And misconceptions that governing bodies, whether it's the American, Canadian, whatever they are, they don't do much to correct those misconceptions, because it helps in that agenda to not just divide us as a people, but also isolate us from any supports that may be coming from other places that aren't our people. So they view us as welfare bums, freeloaders, non-contributors. All the better for them. The reality is we pay a lot of taxes. The reality is a lot of the monies that we get to cover those expenses don't come from their tax base. It comes from annuities and things like that, from agreements that were made in the past. And like any legal agreement, because they say, well, they use a lot of the money that they were supposed to give us for other things, so now they don't have it. That doesn't mean that they're not liable for it. So wherever they're getting that money from to cover us, it's not their tax base, and it's not even what's minimum due to us, because we keep trying to cut those things back. But those are a lot of the misconceptions about who we are, and we have to heal from those things as well, because it has crazy impacts on us. I feel it myself when I'm walking outside of our community. Anybody looking at me, that's what I feel. They're looking at me with a particular frame of mind, or through those lenses. So when I say through those lenses, like putting on a pair of glasses, whatever is on those glasses, that's what you're seeing through. And those are the things that are on those lenses. Regardless of the reality of who I am, for those of you watching, regardless of who you are as a human being and the life that you've led and the things that you've gone through, those other things are there. I remember a few years ago, I was doing a presentation. This was in Timmins. Excuse me. So this was Timmins in February. I was working for the OFIFC at the time, and I was the Gijin Shopping and I'm a Kind Man program worker. So the Timmins area, one of the workers that I trained with was there. So they asked me to be part of a day-long conference. And there were 3 of us who were scheduled to speak, and I was scheduled to speak on the DJ program. And so the northern communities are very different from local communities, partly because of the treaty agreements we have, so the resources we have, and the fact that we have such a large population and still, um, although it's approached and stamped, it's still a fairly large land base by comparison to other indigenous communities. So we have a lot of strength. Um, but when I went there, I noticed a few things. This is prior to the conference. Um, going to the One Mall in Timmins. And if you know the territory, there's a lot of small indigenous communities around it. So there's tons of indigenous people who are coming and going from Timmins. So I saw a lot of indigenous people. And one of the things I noticed was they didn't look at each other. They didn't look at me. Here, that's what I'm used to. We look at each other. So I noticed that. The cab driver who was taking me from the hotel I was at to different places I was going seemed to be the same cab driver every time I called. But he was indigenous, but not very talkative. Wouldn't look me in the eye. Short one-word answers. And that night, prior to the conference, ordered a pizza, had it delivered to my room, and it was an indigenous man who was delivering it. And same thing. He came to the door, so I had the cash. I took the pizza from him, and he stood back and had his head down. I wouldn't look at him. For me, an indigenous man from Southern Ontario, particularly from Six Nations, that was odd. Because I'm used to, even more out in things like Hamilton, Toronto, or any of these other mainstream cities. I see an indigenous person, we tend to make some sort of eye contact and acknowledgement of each other. So, go to this conference, and I find out when I get there that, this is Timmins in February, and the other presenters weren't able to make it into Timmins because of a snowstorm that was in and around the city. So they asked if I could speak longer. So I ended up basically being the only speaker for the whole day. And a lot of these things that I'm talking about throughout this series of videos, and the DJ program, that was what I was talking about. So at the end of the day, the facilitator asked me if there was any last words that I wanted to say that I would want them to leave with. Now, I should have something prepared for that, but I never do, and it surprises me every time I get asked that question when I'm presenting something. So when they said that, those individuals that I had come across in the mall, the cab, pizza, and all that stuff, and a conversation I had with the person who was helping me when I arrived that day. She was a non-native lady, and she had an ex-husband who was indigenous, but they were still very close friends and things like that. So while we were waiting for people to arrive, because I got there very early, little conversation, so I got a flavor of what was there. There was about 150 people, all frontline social workers and counselors and things like that, in and around the Timmins area. But only 5, including myself and my co-facilitator, were indigenous. And 3 were male. And this was, that was what I was talking about. Indigenous dominant, indigenous male issues. So when I decided what I was going to talk about, I only had a few seconds to decide this. What I did was I asked if all the indigenous men in the room would stand up. And I was already standing up, so my co-facilitator and 9 individuals stood up. And I said, here's what I want you all to understand. I said, in front of you, you have this package. And what is it? It's a little portfolio with handouts and things like that. And a copy of the DJ manual, all that stuff. And I said, when we're done here, you're all going to go home, or maybe you're going to go to your office, and you're going to have that package. And maybe you're going to sit down, you're going to leaf through it, you're going to read it, or you're going to go to your office and it's going to sit on your desk. You're going to put it on your desk with the intention of reading it, and maybe you will, maybe you won't. And some of you are going to go and put it in a desk drawer or put it in a file cabinet, and you're never going to look at it ever again. That's attending a company, and that's whatever your proclivities are. I said, but here's what I want you to understand: all the things that I talked about today. Every Indigenous male that you come across, every Indigenous person that you come across, whether it's coming to your agency for services, whether it's coming to your agency as a worker, whether it's the taxi driver taking you to your destination, whether it's the Indigenous person that you meet walking in the mall, whether it's the Indigenous man delivering your pizza, everything that I talked about sits on their shoulders, and they do not have the opportunity to take a file folder and file it away where they're never going to see it again. It is always there. That is what I want you to take away. And that's what I want a lot of you to understand. Whether you're aware of these things or not, they sit there with us. That needs to be healed. Now, when I say heal, that's not about getting rid of it, because you can't get rid of it. More what it is putting it in a place where it doesn't drag you down anymore. Putting it in a place where, as odd as this may sound, it benefits you. Right? You can use it as a tool. Once it's there, if you can't get rid of it, make it useful. So that's where this concept comes in, this edge of the woods. Now, edge of the woods has a personal connotation, and it has a political connotation. Now, I'm just going to very quickly touch on the political part of it in terms of Haudenosaunee culture. Because one of the things that the Peacemaker came to realize when he was giving us these words of peace, from what we understand, when he knew before going in, that grief and condolence was going to be an issue in delivering this word and helping people accept it, and moving past their gripes and grievances with each other. And as he moved through, you realize that it's much bigger. So there was this process that he worked through with Ayahuasca for grief, the wampum strings at Cuba Lake. So that's a long story. I'm not going to go into that part. And that became a big part of understanding when putting up a chief, installing a chief. As I had mentioned earlier before, that in order to install a chief had to die, which means you have to go through that grieving process. So they have this process called Edge of the Woods, which is part of that grieving for that person who's passed on, that chief who's passed on, the chiefs who had been working with that person, and the community as a whole. This Edge of the Woods is much more personal. It's not really a part of that political process, but it's an understanding of our grief process. So try to visualize our territory prior to it being taken over by people of European descent. What they say is that a squirrel could hop into a tree somewhere halfway up Quebec and travel south and not have to touch ground again somewhere around South Carolina. That's how thick the forest was. There weren't these large swaths of clear-cut areas. Essentially, the only places that were open were our villages. Whether that be our villages as Haudenosaunee or villages from the Huron or the other confederacies and associations along the eastern seaboard. But essentially, those areas, the village, the palisade, the crop area, that stuff. They were these small dots of clearing in this sea of forest. And our understanding is that there were a lot of things that could happen to you in the forest. So, in particular, our men were well trained to survive in that. To know what to eat, what not to eat, things to look out for, and how to use minimal tools to live out there when they need to, particularly for our messengers. And if you've ever been through a heavily wooded area, in large part because of how thick the canopy is, sometimes there's not a lot of vegetation underneath it. Now, mind you, there are tons of areas where it's very difficult to walk through, but usually that's because there's ample sunlight coming through, and the canopy isn't nearly as thick. Particularly if you're in an area that is full of pines or cedars or things like that, because of the acidity in the needles. There is no vegetation because nothing else will grow except for the pine trees. So in that sense, if it's thick enough to be like that, it's very dark in there. So you're traveling through darkness, and that the areas of the village are the light. So that's the edge of the woods. So you're traveling through darkness, you're coming into community, coming into family, whether it's blood family or clan family, is coming into the light. So you go to the edge of the woods to come into the light. So that's a literal thing. It's also a metaphor for healing and process. So they say that there was a speech, and there's different interpretations, and I'm going to read an interpretation of that speech, and then I'm going to go line by line and explain some of the thought behind those lines. Okay. So, and what they call this the wiping of the tears. It's a way of welcoming someone into that light, into the light of day. Right. So, I give great thanks that you have arrived here in safety at the wood's edge, where we kindle a fire, we smoke together, we mingle our tears together, with very few words. For we give thanks you have escaped all the calamities that could have befallen you as you traveled in the forest. Calamities, pestilences, wild beasts, someone holding a war club, or the pool where you saw your ancestors and wished to go there with them. And the evil voices saying they will tear you down. And there is nothing we could do until you came to the wood's edge. Right? Now, our people are orators, so that's you could say that's kind of a simplified version of some of the speeches they would say. And for people who are adept in our languages, there is no verbatim speeches that they give. There were points that they had to talk about, but then it was also part of the flourish of the speaker to embellish a little further on those points. So this is more this speech that I just read is kind of a watered down the basics of that speech, or a kind of speech that they would give. But those are the points that were in there. So line by line, I give great thanks that you have arrived here in safety at the wood's edge, where we kindle a fire, smoke together, and mingle our tears together with very few words. Essentially, what they're saying is, now that you've arrived, I am here for you. I'm physically present. I'm mentally aware, emotionally stabilized to receive you, and spiritually open for whatever it is that you're bringing. Right? We're glad that you're here. We'll sit in silence. What that means is, we who are receiving you are going to be largely silent. We're going to meet you where you're at. If you're ready to talk, we will listen. If there's other things that you need, we'll be there for that. We are not going to pressure you into talking more than what is necessary. And in that moment, the things that was necessary was, what is your name? What is your nation? What is your clan? where are you coming from? And the reason for that is because they wanted to know if you have relatives here, whether that's blood relatives or clan relatives. Because for the duration of the time that you're there, those would be the ones who would be responsible for your care. So that's why that stuff was necessary to ask. But beyond that, other than telling you things that might be important to know, like be careful, we've recently had a bit of a calamity. We're going to look after you, but you should be aware of this. Things like that. But in terms of peppering with questions, they're not there for that. Not in that moment. So when they talk about the fire, now in that they didn't say fire, but this is in essence what we're talking about is with condolence, with that understanding of the Great Lawn and things like that. They talk about the fire. So there's a lot of metaphor. So we have this internal fire. And the physical representation of that is a real fire. And we will sit across from it, which means you on that side of the fire, me on this side of the fire. I will support you across this fire. Right now it's you who needs the condolence, so I will provide that condolence. And it's with the understanding that if there comes a time when I need to be condoled, you will provide that condolence. It's a mutual support thing. So that's saying that we're glad you're here and we're here for you. That's what it's saying. That's what they're saying is we are here to assist you physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It's conveying with words this empathy and understanding that just so everybody hears it, we're all aware that we are here to support you because you are new and you're coming from the darkness at the edge of the woods. We give thanks you have escaped all the calamities that could have befallen you as you traveled in the forest. Calamities, pestilence, wild beasts. We're just happy you survived. We're happy you made it. We're happy that you made it through all of that and that you're now here and that we can see your face. That we can see you and that you can see us. We're happy about that. We recognize that might not have been the case. Something may have happened to you along the way. Some form of calamity. You may have slipped and sprained or broken an ankle, broken a bone. Slipped and broken your neck. A lot of things could have happened. Beasts, at the time. Bears, wolves. And if you understand deer, elk, and moose, the Disney version is not the real version of those animals. They can be fairly aggressive, especially during things like mating season or if their young are nearby. And so all of those things may have happened to you. And if they did, and you survived it, that doesn't mean that you're fine and good. They affect you physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And it's a recognition of that effect. That those are the things that can happen. And they're giving voice to that. That they're recognizing that's all a possibility. Someone holding the war club. So even though it's a recognition that even though you are in Haudenosaunee territory, we are a Haudenosaunee community. That doesn't mean every individual that you come across out there carries the peace. It doesn't mean that they have good intentions with you. So when they talk about that war club, that's the metaphor. Maybe it's a literal war club, or maybe the war club is an ill intent. And they may have done something to bring that intent to fruition. So it's a recognition that you may have come across those individuals. It's also a recognition that maybe they weren't necessarily looking to harm you physically, but intimidation, bullying, right? So in a modern sense, when we talk about the edge of the woods, sometimes that's what we're talking about is someone who is coming through a period of being bullied, right? Intimidation, carrying the war club. Essentially, that's someone who does not have peaceful intentions. The metaphor of the warfare. The pool where you saw your relatives and you wanted to go there with them. That can be something as blunt and as direct as wanting to commit suicide, or it can also be the implication of what's called a suicidal ideation, allowing oneself to die, not defending oneself in an unsafe situation. It's a recognition that sometimes a lot of these things that happen were overwhelming, and because you're in the woods, essentially alone in the dark, out in the wild, you're not as strong in defending that, or you're not able to see the options. You're not able to rely on other people. So it's an understanding that sometimes it feels like it would be easier to just give up. So when they talk about that seeing your relatives in that water, it's like a mirror. And that mirror is a reflection of something better. So I'll go there. Seeing your relatives, the ones who have passed on, go there for their one grace kind of thing. So it's a recognition that that may have been a possibility, but still glad that you made it here, and we can help you with that. And the evil voice is saying that they will tear you down. When you're experiencing things like mental fatigue, long periods of time alone, huge stresses, coming through that darkness, the things that you have to survive out there, messages can come in. And because you're alone, you don't have people to bounce these messages off of, does that make sense, or things like that. But it's also a recognition that there can be mental illness. Now, that's the modern term for it, is mental illness. We never had that term back then, back in those times. And hearing things like that wasn't even necessarily thought to be an illness. A lot of people who heard those things, we had that belief that these are messages. But again, they need to be interpreted. This came to me. This is what it was. What do you think? But when you're out there by yourself, you can't bounce these things off of anybody else. But it's a recognition that if that's happening, you need people's support. You need people's help. Talking to you, being able to say what's there, and not being seen as a threat, and not being intimidated by someone who is revealing that they're hearing voices that may not be their own, or their perception of things isn't the same as most people. Essentially, not treating them as something different or as less than human because they have this different thing going on for them. And there's nothing we could do until you came to the edge of the woods. So that's a recognition that we are very much aware that for you to heal from these things, you have to choose to heal from it. We can stand here and receive you at the edge of the woods, but we can't go in there and pull you in against your will. You have to choose to come into the light. Essentially, you have to choose to get help. You have to choose to be open to being helped. You have to choose to be open to being supported. We can't make the choice for you. So you have to choose the light. Essentially, you have to choose wellness. You have to choose balance. And we will be here if you make that choice, but we also will be here if you don't make that choice. If you choose to stay there, we will still be here ready for you when you decide to step into the light. Right? Step into a place where you can be supported. step into that daylight where we can see you. It's also in that it's explaining that we can't put ourselves at risk, to save you. Going into that darkness is putting ourselves at risk, and it may not be. Now, some people may say that, well, maybe it's a worthwhile risk if you can save a life. Possibly, but that life you're saving, if they're not choosing that, it could be very easy for them to go back and go further out. And in that sense, if I take that risk and something happens to me because I took that risk, and then you still choose to go on, then essentially what's happened is I've needlessly not just endangered my life, but put undue stress and strain on the people that care about me as well. So my strength is standing in the light and receiving, not in putting myself at risk. So choose the light and we will help you. That's essentially what they're talking about. Reinforcing that stepping into the light, it's a safe place. We're making it a safe place. If necessary, we will demonstrate that it is a safe place. We'll be truthful and we'll be as honest as we can in that process. We can't coerce you to seek help. We can't make promises that we can't follow through with and complete in order for you to come into that light. Remember how I talked earlier about observable pattern of behavior. If I make a promise that I can't keep, then essentially what I've done is I've proven myself to be untrustworthy. My pattern I just showed there in doing that is you can't believe what I said. And for me to welcome someone into that light, I can't do that. I can't make those kinds of promises. I have to be truthful and honest. So no coercion. Being as open to you for who I am is part of creating that safe space. So essentially, that's what this process that we're talking about when, in a modern sense, going into services, whether it's at risk or another agency. Essentially, that's what we're opening the door for. And from a civilization point of view, within the Shoshone civilization's point of view, that's our perspective on when we open that door. That edge of the woods kind of thing. We're inviting you to take that step. So, in that sense, if you are watching this video now, you've at least taken a bit of a step into the light, if not walked in completely in open. And in that sense, these videos, they're part of that process of showing you that this is a safe space. And in the context of this in particular, safe space format. This being a contribution to men's program at risk. So, yeah, that's essentially what I wanted to talk about with this video. In the process of the rest of the videos and that, how that progression is going to go. That understanding that where you are in terms of being a part of this program and what it has to offer. That's essentially what they're looking to offer you, is that safe space in the light. So down the road, not exactly sure, might be the next video, might be another video further down, but we're going to talk about what that particularly means to men. And this concept of what we're told men are supposed to be versus what traditionally, as a civilization, we understand men are supposed to be. In a more practical sense, in a more real sense. Not the surface stuff that we've been taught, but something that's a little more real. That I think all of us experience, but maybe not all of us are feeling safe to express. In a sense, as men still in the woods, because we haven't been given a safe space to just be a man in a much more real sense of that term. But that's a lot of what we're directing this towards now in these videos. So with that, same thing. If you have any questions, pose them to the people that you're working with in this program. I can't speak for them, but hopefully what they will do is they will seek out people, maybe possibly myself or others, who will have some of the answers, or at least we'll try to get some of those answers. But for now, we'll leave it at that. Contemplate as you need to. Any thoughts? Find someone to talk to them about it. Yeah, for now, done with it.